Welcome to the History of Psychology show. I'm your host, Christopher Green from York University in Toronto, Canada. The aim of the show is to interview working historians of psychology, not only about their current work, but also about their backstories, personal and professional, and their views of the field more broadly. Today, I'm really happy to have Larry Stern from Collin College in Plano, Texas. Larry is an expert on the life and career of James McConnell, the University of Michigan psychologist who became most famous for his experiments with flatworms, attempting to transfer memories from one flatworm to another by feeding one flatworm to another. McConnell was also a victim of the notorious Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. Larry's a sociologist, so his perspective is a little different from most historians of psychology. He studied with the legendary sociologist of science, Robert Merton, at Columbia University, and I think you're going to enjoy this talk a lot. So Larry Stern, welcome to the History of Psychology show.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. First, if you would, remind us of why McConnell is a memorable figure in the history of psychology. From the time he was a graduate student in the mid-1950s at the University of Texas, he began developing this extraordinary research program that promised to overturn pretty well everything that psychologists thought they knew about memory. So tell us about that.
Well, actually, there are a number of reasons why McConnell is a memorable figure. And yes, first and foremost is he's famous or infamous for his work on what came to be known as the memory transfer, phenomenon. He was initially working with planaria, which are these 1-inch flatworms, and he trained them to a task, chopped them up into little pieces, and fed them to untrained or naive recipients. Now, these cannibalistic worms, as he called them, that ingested these trained worms, upon being tested, presumably remembered or retained the memory of the task, while those that ingested untrained worms really showed no effect at all. The episode, he referred to it, and this is with not the kind of sensitivity that we would use today, but he referred to it as McCannibal and his Mau hypothesis. He believed that memories were stored in these archival molecules, which challenged all of the prevailing theories that emphasized the role of neural pathways in memory processes. But McConnell was also probably one of the first so-called celebrity scientists. He was a former disc jockey, a television writer. He wrote radio scripts that won national recognition, wrote TV programs, wrote one of the first soap operas, but they didn't put it on the air. Back in the days in a TV station in Cincinnati, in fact. And at the time, there were probably 4 different stereotypes, of scientists. The first one would be the eccentric, unfathomable, preoccupied genius like Einstein, or you had like the Pasteur model, dedicated, passionate, detached, objective, humble, relentless in their pursuit of the truth. Or you had the mad scientist like, Vincent Price or somebody like that, or a nerd. Well, McConnell just broke the mold. I mean, he was just really funny. He was irreverent. He wasn't one to shy away from the media. So then when scientists who typically remain sequestered in their labs are not talking to people in the media, he appeared with his cannibalistic worms, on television. He was on the program The Way Out Men. He was on Mr. Wizard. He was on the Steve Allen show. There were articles written about him and his work that appeared in Time and Newsweek, Life, Esquire, Fortune, and he was eminently quotable. And for example, he would joke about, after the cannibalism studies, professor burgers, where he would feed the brains of deceased professors to students so as to impart their wisdom. Now, I can give you some more examples of his humor, in a few minutes. As you might well guess, this did not endear him to many of his colleagues, and we can, come back to that.
Right. So first, just tell me what was the task that he trained flatworms to do, so that he could tell whether they were conditioned or not.
Initially, it was just simply a bright light and an electric shock to get them to scrunch up. Mm-hmm. Then eventually, he wound up having one of these little miniature tea mazes, and the worms would slither along, and he would try to, teach them to either turn to the left or turn to the right. I mean, we're not talking about rocket science here.
No, but it's an interesting, I don't know, almost satire or parody of the way in which behaviorists were working with rats in those days.
Well, but let me just quickly mention, there's one other thing. See, McConnell was not one of these, one-trick pony, scientists, because concurrent with the memory transfer work that he was doing, he was knee-deep, some would actually say over his head, in behavior modification.
Right.
And this is going to be something that's really interesting, because this is what brought him to the attention of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber.
Well, so
McConnell received one of those bombs.
We will get to that. First, I'd like to know, what was the psychology community's response to this flatworm cannibalism research program?
Mixed, to be kind.
Yeah.
There were some people who were, just totally outraged by it, but some of that had to do not only with the bizarre notion of cannibalized worms, but also the fact that it challenged, the prevailing, theoretical edifice that most people were using. You had people like, Watson, Nobel Prize winner, referring to it as sheer unmitigated rot.
Did he really?
You had other people. You had other folks saying that we know that it's crazy. The question is whether it's crazy enough to be true. You had people referring to McConnell and others as the RNA for lunch bunch, since they were feeding RNA to different worms. In many cases, their veracity was really questioned. But McConnell did get a great deal of support from many top people. His initial work, which was, on regeneration, was published by Harry Harlow in his journal, on the Journal of Comparative Physiology and Psychology.
Something like that,
Pretty, high-toned place. So he was basically somebody who was supportive. Donald Hebb was supportive of McConnell. Gordon Bowers was supportive. Karl Pribram was supportive. But more to the point, in the beginning, the field's beginning to explode. You have all sorts of people now looking at brain behavior, brain biochemistry and behavior.
Mm-hmm.
You have people out at Berkeley, you have people in Wisconsin, pretty much everywhere. And they're having all of these main conferences where people like Sperry and others are showing up. And McConnell was given a seat at the table. Now, he would still joke about it when he was there, saying, I wouldn't know an RNA molecule if it bit me on the ass. He literally said that. But he's there. And more to the point, he's getting a phenomenal amount of money in grants.
Are they government grants or private funding grants? Or
he's getting money from the Atomic Energy Commission, because he's also doing a program where he's irradiating these worms to see how that's going to affect things. From the Atomic Energy Commission, he got $114,000, which in today's dollars is $951,860.
That's a decent
nearly
grant.
$1 million just from the atomic energy. From the National Institutes of Mental Health, he got about $42,000, which is over $350,000 in today's dollars. He also got a prestige career development award, which they paid for him for his salary for 5 years. Michigan itself gave him in-house funds that in today's dollars would be $442,000. I mean, he had close to $2 million in today's funds to do this work.
Wow.
I mean, so what does that tell you?
So
to me, of course, it's interesting, as a sociologist, because my concern is, how are extraordinary claims in science going to be received? And when you take the reception process and you break it down to access to funding, access to publication outlets, the resources and strategies that are used in order to try to attain these sorts of things, the kinds of scientists that are also going to choose to work in this area, problem selection, you learn an awful lot.
Yeah. So let's talk about his interesting little journal. He arrives at Michigan in 1956, and just within 3 years, he's already got his own little in-house informal journal that he calls the Worm Runner's Digest. And the interesting thing
by
about
the way, let me quickly state that there's no pun intended there. You would think because of the cannibalism studies and digest, there'd be a
not digesting the worms. That's
yeah, but it turns out that the journal was its maiden voyage was prior to the cannibalism experiments.
Oh, okay, all right. So the interesting thing about the Worm Runner's Digest is that it not only publishes serious sort of research reports, but it also publishes these satirical pieces by McConnell himself. And within a few years, he actually sort of formalizes it and renames it the Journal of Biological Psychology, but still binds it with the satirical pieces themselves, now under the original name, the Worm Runner's Digest. And this confuses psychologists and librarians as to what he's up to. So what's the story there?
In the beginning, when he was doing his regeneration work, because remember, cannibalism didn't just pop up from out of nowhere. That research started when he was a graduate student back at UT Austin with Robert Thompson, who, by the way, went on to, a very prestigious, career, at LSU, but working with rats. And they just simply did that conditioning. It's when McConnell got to Michigan that the chairman of the department went and said, by the way, you heard about this publish or perish stuff? It's true. Mm-hmm. So McConnell needed to have a publishable research program. So he remembered that back in the day when he was with Thompson, they were watching some kind of television program, and there was an ad on TV. You might remember it was the Tony Home Permanent. It was you'd have two twins, and there would be one who would go and spend, a whole boatload of money to get her hair coiffed, and somebody else who would buy for $1.50, the Tony Home Permanent. And they'd say, which is the Tony, which one is the phony? And McConnell realized that, well, if you take one of these planarian, and if you chop it in half, head will regenerate a tail will regenerate a head, which one's going to have retain the memory? Does that, finds out to his delight that the tail seemed to remember as much as the head did, sends it back to Harlow's journal. There's some grumbling on the part of the referees, but they take it. Mm-hmm. But then with another student, he decided to chop it off into so many different pieces that eventually you had worms that had no part of the original body whatsoever. And he believed that showed retention as well. So he presents this paper with his student at the American Psychological Association, and it's picked up by Newsweek magazine. And as soon as that happens, and remember, this is now during late 50s, we're in a battle with the USSR, Sputnik, things like that.
Right.
So we're now having all of these science fairs. So you have hundreds of high school students from all over the country writing McConnell, asking him, in one instance, please send me a couple of hundred trained worms. My science fair project is due Wednesday. And in other instances, they were just asking, where do you get them? How do you train them? So he wrote a couple of letters and he realized that just wasn't going to work. So he and his grad students put together about a 14-page manual on how to get worms, how to train them, and so on. And as a joke, he puts on it, we'll call it the Worm Runner's Digest, and he puts down volume 1, number 1. And before you know it, she's now getting submissions
to
the journal to publish. So he thought, having a sense of humor, that he would pep things up a bit and have the satires and those sorts of things. And he did, in fact, write a number of these. McConnell also wrote science fiction. He had some wonderful stories, mostly about learning theory and behaviorism. Mm-hmm. And one of them is reprinted, which you really, if you haven't seen it, you need to read. It's about a psychology professor walking in the woods, trying to figure out how to teach his students about, learning theory. And he gets abducted by aliens. And when he wakes up, he's in this huge Skinner box, on a alien spaceship with a big nipple on the wall, which will emit, a warm, creamy substance. And then, a lever where you'll get protein pellets. How he gets away, I won't, give you the story.
Don't ruin the story.
but read this, it's really, quite funny.
So did he publish this himself, or did he publish these science fiction stories himself, or did he get people to publish his science fiction stories?
He had people publish his science fiction. He had an agent. He published 5 or 6 of them, one on Grandma Perkins and the Space Invaders. One was called Avoidance Behavior. I mean, and these are all in pulp science fiction, books. I mean, I was able to get them on eBay, so I have all of the copies of these, which are really quite interesting. It gives a little background, a biography of McConnell, as well. But Harry Harlow contributed 2 pieces to the journal. B.F. Skinner also contributed 2 under the name of F. Galton Pennywhistle. He used a pseudonym.
Skinner wrote under a pen name. Okay.
He wrote under a pen name, but there were just incredible, spoofs. One of my favorites, were spoofs that other people have written as well, and cartoons that were, put in there. There was a spoof of Freudian theory, which was just hilarious. It was called Some Comments on an Addition to the Theory of Psychosexual Development. It was by Sigmund Freud, and they introduced the nasal stage. It occurred between the anal and phallic stages, in which the libido is localized primarily in the mucous lining of the nose. Though the consequences of poor nasal training, the author writes, might not be as drastic as those accompanying poor toilet training, 2 pathologies might ensue. Feelings of superiority that lead you to turn your nose up at others, or being a busybody and constantly sticking your nose in other people's business.
Right. So I can see how he was the kind of guy who was going to cause some consternation in other people.
The Worm Runner's Digest was referred to as the scientific playboy of its time. So yes, at the same time though, and this is of some importance for the memory transfer episode, many of the works of transfer studies were also published in that journal. Now, I want to be clear, there are over 250 different articles that appeared, mostly in Science, Nature, other reputable journals. Only 25% of them turned up in the Worm Runner's Digest. McConnell also used the editorial to bring people up to date on what's been going on, and he was using some rather bombastic terms. This is of revolutionary proportions. And since you also had some straight science, he did find out that some people reading the Worm Runner's Digest were complaining to him that they couldn't tell the straight science from the funny science. They just didn't know what to do.
Right.
I mean, I don't know how you can take, the Gesundheits effect, and say that it's, straight science.
Well, he did.
So yes, what he sequestered the front, the funny stuff, he banished it to the back, turning it upside down.
Right.
So you
right.
had the Worm Runner's Digest. If you opened it this way, you had straight science, and then the other way. And then when that didn't work, he wound up now twinning it to the Journal of Biological Psychology, which still wound up being front and back. It just wasn't entitled Worm Runner's Digest anymore.
Right, right. So we're well into his career now, but if we can, let's go back to the beginning. Where was McConnell from? What was his upbringing like? How did he become such a renegade figure in psychology?
Interesting background. He was born in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, roughly 40 miles south of Tulsa, but spent most of his formative years in Shreveport, where his father basically owned and operated a bus station cafe. He said that his mother, who was very, very religious, devout Christian, told him he needs to do good in life. His father told him, yeah, you need to do good, but you need to have observable measures that you're doing good. So he wound up having somewhat of a different bent, to this. But he was a devout Christian at first. He was a youth leader. He expected to do medical missionary work. But at the age of 15 or 16, he says that he realized, and these are his words, that he was considerably brighter than most of the ministers and church elders who lectured him so frequently. He apparently raised moral and ethical issues that they couldn't solve to his satisfaction. He concluded that most of them didn't know much about the subject of religion and or didn't practice what they preached. So he left the church. At the age of 17, he goes to Centenary College in Shreveport, where he takes his first psychology class. And he says it blew his mind because he had a woman teaching the class. This is 1942. And she talked a great deal about Freud and sex and did it right out loud in the open. So it sounded almost too good to be true. So he changed his major from chemical engineering to psychology.
Really?
Then the war came.
Yeah.
And he left and was inducted into the Navy in 1944. By that time, all of the shouting or all the shooting was done. But he was a crewman on the ship that delivered the atomic bomb to the Bikini Island test site. And as an officer, he was the officer in charge the night that the bomb was loaded onto the ship. So he said, yes, if things went wrong, he might have been known for other things now as well, for that, detonation. After he got out, he went back to LSU and he, started taking psychology classes again. He tried to keep himself alive. As I mentioned, he was a member of the media. He was a part-time announcer at the LSU station in Baton Rouge.
I should mention for our listeners who don't know, LSU is Louisiana State University. But go on.
Yep. And he eventually goes and he works at a radio station in Lake Charles. He meets this woman who is a sort of an actress and the leader of a salon, who has all the intelligentsia of Shreveport, I guess, who come in, to talk. And he was trying to do some acting. And she said that, well, you need to change the way that you speak. Same thing happened with the radio stations. He had this Southern drawl. So he completely changed to have this, nondescript Midwestern, accent that, he got under her, tutelage. And then he started working in radio stations, writing the scripts, the TV station that I mentioned about, the soap opera. What happened, though, is that he developed an ulcer from doing all these things. Then his father died. He goes and works at the cafe for a bit, gets a second ulcer, and is convinced by a friend that, maybe you want to go to graduate school, and he then gets into UT Austin.
Back in the old days when we thought that graduate school wasn't the kind of thing that was going to give you an ulcer.
Well, while he's there, by the way, he gets a Fulbright scholarship. He goes to Oslo. He works with Dallenbach, or is it Dallenbach?
Dallenbach, yeah. Karl Dallenbach. Yeah.
Karl Dallenbach is his advisor. And I even found a letter at one point where Dallenbach sort of suggests to McConnell about the regeneration study. He says it was the Tony Phony thing, but Dallenbach also writes him a letter saying, you might want to think about doing that also.
That's an interesting.
So then he's often, then once he's there, he does the worm stuff and he's often running, or slithering, as the case may be. But the field then passes him by.
Yeah. So what? So let's go. So let's jump back forward to the 1960s again. What becomes of the planarian cannibalistic research program? There's a lot of controversy about it. There's some big failures to replicate.
He's riding high, and he has a friend of his who is at UT Austin named Alan Calvin. Alan Calvin is a psychologist. He's now the president of some college out in California. And he also started what was called the Britannica Center of Learning and Motivation, where they were going to be doing programmed learning. And he invites McConnell to come out there to Berkeley. Well, no, I'm sorry, it was at Stanford. Pays him $15,000 in 1961, which is $120 some odd thousand salary as of today. Remember, McConnell has no tenure. He's an assistant professor, at Michigan. He goes out there. Alan Calvin's brother is Mac Calvin, the Nobel Prize winner, who would like to win a second Nobel Prize. So he's got very interested in this transfer stuff and wanted to jump in to see what he can do. Now, McConnell's out on the West Coast. He brings two of his graduate students who now do a postdoc at Berkeley in Mac Calvin's lab to try to do the memory transfer, research. I mean, these are top dogs now doing these things. And there are also going to be seminars which have other very eminent scientists who are going to be there. And what happens is that there are troubles right from the start, and they can't get the worms to learn in the first place. You certainly can't transfer a learned response if you can't get them to learn. But it's also because of the multidisciplinary nature of this kind of work. Yeah. For example, McConnell says you've got to know the beast. You've got to know the worm. You got to know what's going on. You have to understand how it moves and so on. And if you're going to put it in a learning trough, or trough, as it's moving along, slithering along, they have to be somewhat comfortable. And they leave a sludge, behind them to some extent, some of their goop. Now, we don't know whether or not that goop is just normal goop or whether that goop is going to be imparting information. Well, Calvin, who is a biochemist, and Ed Bennett, who's his biochemist, is saying, well, every time we're going to be doing an experiment, every time we're going to put a worm in there, we have to sanitize it, and we got to wipe the entire thing clean. So there was no trail at all. So we have that problem. But also there's a very big difference in definitions of what learning is. As McConnell is trying to convince them, you wind up taking these worms, you train them, you shock them, you get a baseline, and then you wind up seeing whether or not you can improve, upon that, at a statistically significant level. As far as Calvin and Bennett were concerned, it's like you either learned it or you didn't.
Right. There's
got to be, 80, 90% retention or so. It's like if you give an exam in your statistics class, if a student, gets a 60, are you going to say they didn't learn anything? Yeah. So now there's a whole controversy over how do you interpret the data? How do you run the worms? But since Calvin's a big guy and the neuroscience research program has just started with Francis Schmidt, which is huge, and they have the neuroscience research bulletin, Calvin, after going and making a presentation with Bennett at one of the National Academy of Science meetings, is asked then to go and submit it to the neuroscience research program. He does. And now you've got top people in a journal that goes to the top elite saying, we were unable to train planarians reliably. How could you now say you're transferring learning when we can't even show that it exists?
Right.
So that was really tough. So what happened, of course, is that, people say worms, can't learn, but rats can. So people shift to rats. And there were going to be 4 different labs, one of which was Alan Jacobson, who was McConnell's grad student and the postdoc out in Berkeley. They're now working with rats. Now, McConnell, seeing what's going on, and this is so in keeping with who he is. First, he starts working with salamanders. That didn't work, too well. I think Sperry was working with salamanders where he was taking their eye out and dealing with the reticular. So he tried to see if that could be transferred, and as he said, he couldn't get the damn beast to learn. So that didn't work. But he said, you can teach minor birds how to talk. Let's get some minor birds, teach them how to talk, and see if we can go and transfer the learned language to naive birds. You're going to
feed minor birds to
other minor birds. And you got a picture, I have this image of McConnell now, who, when he went to present at meetings, and it was a performance, I could picture him standing there, with a minor bird on his shoulder, with a bandage on his head, squawking out, things that he'd picked up in the lab, like Calvin's an idiot, or Bennett's a dope.
Right.
But again, he couldn't get them to learn either.
So it becomes a big problem, and it's kind of a problem would ruin a lot of people's career, but it doesn't seem to have stopped McConnell for a beat. He just shifts over to behavior modification and becomes a star there. So tell us about that.
Well, before he shifts to it, because it's not really a shift, these are concurrent trajectories, that he's taking. McConnell does eventually go and work with rats. And his funding is now drying up because, quite frankly, the NIMH and NSF, they have to hedge their bets. When they think that there's something here that might really be, paradigm breaking in some way, they're going to bet on certain horses. And there were other eminent people putting in proposals. Frank Rosenblatt from Cornell, one of the fathers of, AI, artificial intelligence. who actually created a perceptron, which was that was used for some time. He was doing this work. George Ungar, who I know we won't get to talk about, was the discoverer of histamines. He was a very eminent scientist. He was in this whole hog. He's the one that literally was able to train thousands of rats to avoid the dark, took their brains, purified it, isolated the chemical that he believed coded for it, injected it into others. I mean, the field really took off in different directions. They're getting all of this money, but McConnell is still now trying to do catch up by coming up with a good learning paradigm, because Ungar was a pharmacologist. Mm-hmm. And McConnell is saying his work is not that good. He's beating up the rat to shove him in the box because once it's been shocked once or twice, it doesn't want to go in there again. And that he wanted something that was going to be a lot neater and cleaner. He eventually did get a grant in 1969, an ambitious grant for a lot of money. But it turns out that this was during the Nixon years and the money dried up and he wound up never getting it. So he's kind of doing things, but it also gets back, if I could just mention, not only was Ungar, according to McConnell, a horrible behaviorist, but he tries to replicate Ungar, and he says, all right, George, so here's what you did, and you ran the rats, and you did it every single day. And Ungar goes and says, no, aren't you civilized? I didn't do it every single day. We did it, Monday through Friday. We don't go into the lab on the weekends. And McConnell says, no, when you're supposed to do this thing, you're supposed to do it every single day. Well, Ungar says, well, that's not how we do things here. And we got positive results. Yeah. So McConnell now replicates it with that rest period interposed and starts getting positive results. Basically saying there's an incubation effect, which, today we would refer to as the consolidation of memory. That happens to take time. But meanwhile, McConnell is really getting involved in behavior modification. And from the get-go, he loves Skinner's work. When he first started in 1958, while he's doing these things, he gets invited to work with Wilbur Schramm and others on a panel on motivation and persuasion, sponsored by the Defense Department. He writes, he's teaching a new course in the psychology of influence and motivation. And basically what he says he wants to do, and now this is his hyperbole again, is he wants now to combine conditioning, techniques with group pressures, propaganda, attitude change, chemical injections, hypnosis, and re-education. In fact, he says, I wanted to use any technique that was legal and, in my opinion, moral and non-dangerous to get mental patients to think and feel and act normally.
Wow.
He then goes and says, and this is all during the same time, to newspapers, because it's now going to be this behavioral revolution. He publishes an article in Esquire called Psychoanalysis Must Go. And McConnell says things like, I could turn a Christian into a communist in 2 weeks, or vice versa. I could break down a person's ego in 3 hours. And he says, this is published. First, he would give the person a drug that would cause complete but temporary paralysis. Then the subject would be put in an iron lung or some other controlled environment. His ears would be plugged, his eyes would be covered. And as he puts it, you soon become rather eager for any kind of communication. So now the brainwashing can begin.
Yeah, this is the brainwashing. This is the brainwashing paradigm.
This is when you had, what was it, in Korea?
Yeah.
You had the servicemen who are now placed in front of the cameras. Hebb was doing stuff on sensory deprivation as well.
Yeah, there's the whole MK Ultra project from the CIA, right?
Yeah, so McConnell is now getting involved in these things and is now just ripping psychoanalysis, that psychoanalysis is for psychoanalysts. It makes them feel good to try to make somebody else feel better, but it doesn't change anything.
It's funny, he sounds a lot like John B. Watson. I mean, Watson was saying things like this in the 19-teens and the 1920s. And McConnell seems to be echoing that now in, what are we in, the 1970s, I guess.
Yeah, but he also, remember what the 70s were like, with Black Panther movement, all sorts of different things. because McConnell then also writes what turned out to be a famous article in Psychology Today. Now, he didn't choose the title, but it was called "Criminals Can Be Brainwashed Now." Angela Davis wasn't happy about reading this, by the way, and literally, had a rally at Michigan when McConnell was talking, one night. But this is what he says. This is this flashpoint. McConnell, without skipping a beat, goes and says, "I believe the day has come when we can combine sensory deprivation with drugs, hypnosis, and astute manipulation of reward and punishment to gain almost absolute control over an individual's behavior. It should be possible then to achieve a very rapid and highly effective type of positive brainwashing that would allow us to make dramatic changes in a person's behavior and personality. I foresee the day when we could convert the worst criminal into a decent, respectable citizen in a matter of just a few months, perhaps even less than that. And we should reshape our society so that we all would be trained from birth to want to do what society wants us to do."
These are the kind of hyperbolic claims that behaviorists made a lot, but he's even more forceful than most, I can see.
And this is what, attracted his attention to Kaczynski.
Right. So McConnell was also the author of a very successful psychology textbook. As I recall, Ludi Benjamin wrote an article several years back, where he seemed to discover that McConnell was the source of the very popular myth that John Watson had been fired from Johns Hopkins because he was doing sex research. Tell us about that book and what its impact was on the field.
Best-selling textbook. McConnell, of course, also said that he behaviorally shaped the salespeople. He would send them all, freeze-dried Nebraska steaks, for Christmas, the entire time. He, as I mentioned before, put cartoons in it. He started each chapter with a vignette in the first page, where you had to get to the end of the chapter to read the denouement of his particular story. And it just sold like hotcakes. It went through, I have, I think, 3 or 4 editions of it. The later one, he went and got a co-author by the name of Trotter. But this was just something that, made him, buckets of money.
It made him very wealthy, yeah?
It made him very wealthy, but, as I mentioned, he also, went out and, did all of these, workshops. This whole notion of the textbook being written for students, given to students, having them critique it, putting their feedback back into it, which is what? You write a paper and then you get people comments and you go through successive drafts, in a sense. That's what he was doing.
Yeah.
He referred to it as validated work. He wanted to do that now to revolutionize education in the United States. McConnell's at Michigan, and by the way, he's a big Wolverine football, basketball fan. Knows Bo Schlembecker, who is the coach and the athletic director. They used to play poker together. And McConnell was, concerned that you had a lot of these students that were on scholarship who were coming unprepared to college and were kind of falling between the cracks. And he wanted to do good, and rather than go out marching, he says, let's see what we can do to try to go and get these kids, as well as others from financially deprived areas, to learn. He says, because I'd go to the library and I'd see people sleeping, and then I'd see them with video games, and they're just having the time of their lives, So he said, well, going back to his ideas of program learning back at the Britannica Center back in 1961, but going back to that, he said, well, maybe we could do this now. And McConnell was a gamer and a geek for computers, all of the newest stuff. And he says, maybe we can use that as rewards for them to be learning chunks of information. You learn a chunk, you get to play a video game. In the video game, you're taught problem solving. There's hand-eye coordination. There are all the kinds of learning skills that we could now use. And we can set this up where we can help people.
So like gamification of education decades
Yeah.
before that phrase had come into use.
Absolutely. And McConnell also, he wanted to work with Schlumberger. He says, we can also work this out. The analogy was a flight simulator. If you're going to be flying a jet and you're sitting there and you have the simulation, everything in front of you. He said, we can program your rivals of next week's defense or offense into this thing, and we can actually see it all coming at us and know how to anticipate certain things, to give you a leg up, on that.
Yeah.
Well, Schlumberger comes up with like 150 grand for computer terminals, for space, for other sorts of things to get this done. So McConnell then wants now to go out and market this to everyone, gets an agent, and it's referred to as the Hercules Project. Proposals are being written. I have a copy of the pitch that he made, to big money people. It never gets off the ground, although there were lots of serious nibbles. Apple was interested in it, IBM, Lotus, a number of other places. But when you're a corporation, you want to call the shots, and McConnell didn't take kindly to that.
Right.
He was told that, listen, if you want to dance with the elephants, you have to let them lead. And McConnell would say, yeah, well, I'm the 500-pound gorilla, so I don't know that this is going to work.
Right.
So he's trying to get, this to be bought. And then they realize that, well, colleges don't have that much money. So we should start first with teaching people how to perfect a golf swing or something like that, which McConnell was not willing to put the revolution off for that long.
Right. Not nearly as exciting as training an entire big time college football team.
But, he was writing proposals for that. And of course, what they said is that this sounds too much like an academic proposal, and these people don't care who Skinner is. You have to go and show them that there's a prototype, and they would say what the prototype's going to be, and McConnell would say, you don't understand. They have to be validated. In the proposal, I can't tell you what the finished product's going to be because we have to first do it and go through these successive waves of drafts and changes and modifications so that we know that it's going to work.
Right.
So, that eventually, just sort of blew up.
Corporate R&D and academic research are not exactly the same world. So McConnell is really good at drawing attention to himself, obviously. But one of the people he probably didn't want to draw attention from, as you mentioned before, was Ted Kaczynski, better known maybe as the Unabomber. Could you tell us a bit about Kaczynski's sort of bloody campaign against the American Academy and about the attack on McConnell himself?
Well, Kaczynski was a student at the University of Michigan where McConnell was teaching. So he probably got a sense of what McConnell was doing. Not so much the memory transfer, although the injections as part of the behavior mod certainly didn't sit well with him. But McConnell was also teaching, and he thought this was his crowning jewel in his career, a two-tiered course on behavior modification, where he would send out like 1,500 students to prisons and various other places to implement behavior mod or B-mod techniques and strategies. So Kaczynski's heard about these things, and it eventually came to light that when he wrote the New York Times piece that he's anti-technology and that he's somebody who's not particularly happy about mind control and these other sorts of things.
We should make it clear that Kaczynski's actually a math student, though, right? Not a psychologist.
That's right. He's a math student, and McConnell wasn't his first victim. He had sent out 10 of these bombs prior to McConnell. Nobody got seriously hurt. The bombs were crude affairs, something that you could literally, get out of the anarchist cookbook, how to go to send this along. But eventually, McConnell winds up getting one. A bomb is sent to his house. And this is a huge house out in the country. He has somebody who's working with him in the house, guy by the name of Nick, who opens up the box, and bomb goes off and blows a hole in the ceiling, and McConnell's ears were a little, he couldn't hear for a couple of days, as well. And there was a cover letter which says, "Dear Dr. McConnell, enclosed is my manuscript on the history of the behavioral sciences, of which you played such an important part. I'd be interested in getting your comments," and so on. Well, it turns out that, a year prior to that, of course, I visited McConnell, went to his archives, got all of the material, spent, a day and a half with him, interviewed him, went through all the materials, that he had. And when he saw that letter, he immediately thought that, wait a second, there was a guy here who's doing a manuscript on the history of the behavioral sciences. And he runs down to to his study and he gets out all my correspondence, which says, I'm doing this, under the auspices of Columbia University, where I'm doing my research and so on. But you have the ATF, the FBI.
ATF is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It's a federal police service, the FBI.
Yep. And then you have the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and then you have the FPI, the Federal Postal Inspectors, who kind of have a little insecure because the FBI is probably a little bit higher on the ranks. But God damn it, you go send something through their mail, they're going to come down on you, as hard as they can.
Right.
Well, they get all of these things, and I'm now teaching at Texas A&M University, and apparently there's a knock on my door. And these agents show up, wanting to talk to me. McConnell fingered me to the feds, when they asked, do you know anybody who might do such a thing?
Well, he must have been terrified, right? So.
Well, he was, but, it's interesting, because he says he had a grad student who went to, undergraduate student in Michigan who went out to A&M. And I got to meet him and to talk. And it turns out, for various reasons, the vicissitudes of life, I wasn't able to meet my deadline on the dissertation having to do with McConnell. And my job at A&M was contingent upon doing that in a particular period of time. Since I was unable to do so, my tenure track position after 3 years was ended. And McConnell heard about that through his former student who was at A&M, and then immediately says, oh, well, Stern is now having a problem, getting a job. He couldn't finish the work. He probably hated me for doing it in the first place. And there's this big projection. Yeah. So in this wonderful letter that he writes me, he goes through the whole thing about how the only way he could rationalize it was that I must have been trying to kill him, for all of these motivations. Now that's interesting, since he thinks Freud is bunk, and thought processes don't matter as much. But this is what he actually believed. So I get thoroughly investigated, and it was an interesting time, because when they showed up, I thought that, oh gosh, they're coming to talk to me as an expert.
Right.
I just read through all of his materials. I know everything there was about him. And I remember at the time when I'm going there, since I was leaning left at the time, wondering if I should go and say that Angela Davis, wound up having started a march against Michigan. I don't want to give her that bad attention. So I go in there and they started asking me if I've been certain places. Have you ever been to Chicago? Sure. Have you ever been to Berkeley? Absolutely. Have you ever been to here? Have you ever been there? Sure. Do you know this particular bookstore? Yes, it's right by Columbia University. Well, it turns out that every one of the places they had mentioned was a place that one of the bombs was either sent from or sent to.
Oh,
remember,
really?
There were 10 of them. And there were 2 bookstores in the United States that sold the anarchist cookbook. One was at Columbia University on Broadway at about 112th Street. You had to go down the stairs to get to it. Another one was at Berkeley. And I've been all these places because, where have you been when you go to meetings? Everywhere.
Yeah.
So then they show me the letter. And, I'm almost, I'm astonished. And, I'm from New York. What am I going to say? I looked at them straight in the eye and say, well, what took you so long to come and talk to me? This sounds like me. And they said, son, are you sure you want to be talking like this? I said, well, I guess not with that legal representation. And we went through this whole thing. Now, clearly, I did not fit the profile, because when they came to my house, I had 3 young children, bouncing off the walls. It was sort of a home life. So I began to help them a bit. I found that the letter that was sent to McConnell came from a guy by the name of, the pseudonym was Kloppenberg, and it came from Chicago. And I knew that there was a historian of science who was named Kloppenberg, whose father was a famous chemist. They named a building after him in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin had a very thriving science technology program. So I said, well, maybe this guy came from there.
Right.
And then finally, one of the bombs killed somebody, and Kaczynski is now, well, the Unabomber is on the top 10 list. They're actually #1 most wanted.
Right.
So I get a second wave of interviews from the FBI, with 2 days long interviews with a street-worn, crusty, retired detective chewing nails, I'm sure, he wants this guy bad.
Yeah.
And the good cop, guy by the name of Lauren, who's just going through, all of the, the questionnaire, as to where you are and why you are and so on. And Tony, would just sit there, with his arms crossed, and eventually he'd look at me and he'd say, what do you make of the fact that there's $1 million reward and nobody's come forward? I don't know, Tony. Maybe people who know him are scared shitless about him. I mean, I wouldn't do that. An hour goes by. What do you make of the fact that, when he planted the bomb, outside the bookstore in Sacramento, and the woman saw him? That's where they got the drawing with the guy with the hoodie and the glasses.
Right.
What do you make of the fact that he simply looked at her and nodded and walked slowly away? I don't know, Tony. If it was me, I would have left a trail of urine, going by. I mean, and then he goes and says, well, we want all your information. What do you mean? He says, well, you have a list and background information on every single person that worked in the memory transfer field, who wrote to McConnell. We want to check all of their backgrounds, because I had, like, from the American Men and Women of Science, where they went to school, and they're triangulating. They're trying to go to see what they can do. And I basically said, these are the days when all of this was on 5x7 file cards.
Right.
Not on a computer. And they want to take it, to their, I don't have a copy of these things. So I mentioned that, this is my life, I mean, I don't know what I'll do, if you lose this stuff. And Tony goes and says, do you know it's a federal crime to threaten a federal officer? I said, Tony, listen, you understand? I need this stuff. I eventually got it back, and they put sticky notes by all of the cards of the people they investigated. So I got to see that as well.
Right. So the attack on McConnell is in '85. When is Kaczynski finally arrested? Do you remember?
Oh, that took a couple of years. I'd have to go back and look that up. But there is the one other thing that happens with this is, so they catch Kaczynski, and he's in Montana, and they're now going to take him to Sacramento, which is where the murder, where the bomb that killed somebody was, and that's where he's going to go and stand trial, and they're moving him there. It just so happens that I'm in a conference in Squaw Valley, Nevada, having to do with evolutionary psychology and the law, actually. Beautiful place. And I'm there for like 3 or 4 days. And I happen to be there the days, it seems, that Kaczynski is being transferred to Sacramento.
Oh, my.
Nobody knows this. It's certainly not for public, consumption. But a week later, I'm at home, I get a call. It's from Tony. Tony's asking, hey, Tony, how you doing? I said, and he's asking me. I said, look, Tony, what's up? He says, oh, I was wondering what you were up to. I said, Tony, you never asked me a question that you didn't already know the answer to. What's this all about? Well, we find it kind of interesting that you were up and around the area of Squaw Valley, which is near Sacramento when we were moving Kaczynski. I said, so what are you saying, that, I was going to try to spring him free, that, there was going to be some kind of a plot for me to go and, ambush, federal marshals to get him? He says, well, we're just being able to, cross our T's and cut and, and dot our I's. And I'm sitting there saying, but why would you know that I was in Squaw Valley? I mean, are you still...
They're still following you.
On me? He says, I can't comment on an active investigation.
So this went on for years and years for you. This was not a one-shot deal. This was...
No, and then, by the way, they were trying to get money for Unabomber victims.
Right.
So they took some of his stuff and they auctioned it off on eBay. and Kaczynski's typewriter was there. I figured, gee, I wonder if I put a bid on it, whether I would smoke Tony out to want to get back to me again.
So look, let's tell me a bit about your own background. You were raised in New York and went to Columbia. Had Robert Merton as a supervisor. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, I grew up in Brighton Beach, in Brooklyn, 1950s. Went to Brooklyn College, part of City University of New York as an undergraduate. Wasn't real serious about stuff. Sociology sounded like fun. It's 1970 to 72. Lots is going on, back then. I wound up applying to all of the grad schools. Was told that you'll hate all of them. At least Columbia has some name recognition. Why not go there? Merton is on leave. He's at the center out in Stanford with Harriet Zuckerman, who is his wife and close collaborator. When they come back in '74, I needed to get some sort of funding. So they put me in touch with Harriet Zuckerman, and I was her research assistant. As her research assistant, I said, well, before I even actually went to see her, I said, well, let me at least look her up and see what she has done. And I saw she had an article in a book on aging and society. So I figured that she's into gerontology. Read up all about gerontology and found out, no, that has nothing to do with her interests. She and Merton are, head deep into sociology of science, sociology of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So she wound up being my supervisor. Merton was there all of the time. And at Columbia, I became a member of the famous, I would say, sociology of science seminar, for, 5 or 6 years. Where we would all discuss ongoing research. Merton would have people coming in, from all over the country, to make presentations, as well. And of course, taking their lecture courses. So it was a real, just interesting time. I mean, plus you're in New York, you've got the Knicks, and I'm growing up, I had the Brooklyn Dodgers. At the same time, we had the Brooklyn Dodgers, the New York Yankees, and the New York Giants. We had Mays, we had Mantle, we had Duke Snider. We had the Knick championship years. We had the museums, and being at Columbia those were heady times. I really enjoyed that, and being the research assistant. I was at least given privy to, hidden histories of the development of sociology and the sociology of science. Yeah. And Merton let me tape record his final years, of lectures, as well, which I still go over and listen to because I learned something new, each time I.
Right. Well, he's considered, I guess, the sort of the father of the sociology of science in the U.S. There are lots of views about him. What do you think is the most misunderstood thing about Merton's views of science?
There's his views of science, but there's also just his views on sociology and sociological thinking. Merton has, during the radical 60s and 70s, was sort of pushed to the side by the new radicals and considered an old conservative fuddy-duddy, that the sociological version of functional analysis they considered to be very conservative, a consensus on values in society, everything for a reason. That was totally wrong. Merton was, for the most part, a conflict theorist. His main concern is how conflict is basically inherent and structurally built into all sorts of social structures, creating strains, contradictions, and other sorts of things, which pose difficulties for people to try to navigate through and to manage. So he was not, somebody who was, always for the status quo. And when he was doing his science work, initially, he was also talking about deviance in science. When you had priority disputes, for example, the fact is that you have, scientific knowledge, which is going to generate certain problematics and questions. It shouldn't be a surprise to you that there are going to be different scientists at different parts of the country realizing the significance of a problem, working on them independently. Then you have an independent multiple discovery. And then you have these disputes over who's supposed to get the, right. The recognition for these things. And then Merton was referred to as a positivist when in one of his earliest papers, he wrote about the boojum of positivism, referring to, Lewis Carroll, in The Hunting of the Snark.
Mm-hmm.
And Merton was somebody who basically said that all of scientific knowledge, whether it turns out to be verifiable or whether it turns out to be false in some way, all of that is going to be shaped not only by the intellectual background, but by social factors.
Right.
People accused him of saying, "Oh, well, you're only going to use social factors to try to explain scientific errors." And Merton is saying, "No, well, listen, go back, 1946 to my article in the Sociology of Knowledge, where I clearly state that the main breakthrough of the sociology of knowledge in science is the fact that true ideas are affected and shaped by social factors as well."
Right.
So when you have somebody who's that big, there are a lot of people that just want to find a straw man to make their ideas turn out to be of some greater significance.
Right.
So he did get a raw deal in that instance, but he came through it with flying colors.
So finally, we got to mention this. You attended the most famous rock concert of all time, the Woodstock concert of 1969. You got your T-shirt there. Excellent. Is that a 69 T-shirt? Do you still fit into your?
No, actually, I do have an original one, but it's red, and now with my graying hair, it just clashed.
I see.
So I got a newer version that my daughter, sent me.
I see. That would suit your hair more fully. Than. So tell us.
I wish I still had the tickets. I wish I still had the tickets, I could have, made something on those.
Oh, so you actually had tickets. Most people didn't even have tickets, as I recall, but.
Yeah, I was, 18 and, still, relatively following the rules. But, we went there, as city slickers, and it was an interesting couple of days. When I went with a couple of friends, we had our tents, and one of the guys who was driving knew that area very well because he always used to go up to the country clubs, to Kutcher's and other places that were upstate New York. He knew all the back roads. So we didn't really come across, all of this morass of traffic where people are parked, 5-10 miles away. He knew a back road and is able to pull his car maybe 50 yards from the stage, off to the side.
Nice.
Which was great. And we get out, and we're unloading everything. And my friend goes and says to his girlfriend, because he's wearing these tight bell-bottom jeans, he says, "Look, here's the key to the car. Put it in your purse, to hold on to it, so as we're getting everything." And she goes and she does that. And then we get everything, together, and we're about to go. And then the girl finally goes and says to Mark, the guy, "Do I really need my purse?" And he says, "No, not really." So she throws it into the trunk of the car and slams it shut. Boom. And we finally realize what's going on. And my friend Mark goes and says, "All right, I have an extra trunk key. It's in the car. Let me see if I can, get into my car." So now we had to find like a wire hanger to be able to go in there, and open the door. Well, that's taking too much time. We're hearing music in the background. Richie Havens, I think, is singing at this point. Yeah. And we said, "All right, look, Mark, we're going to go over there. We'll meet you, down by, by the stage, when you get done. We'll set up the tents and so on." Never saw him again.
Yeah, 400,000 people. I guess it was a little hard to find people.
Nobody can get to the front of the stage. Never saw him again. Had no idea what's going on. But meanwhile, we're going and trying to put up our tent. And being, apartment dweller all my life, we wind up seeing this whole area, which seems, to be uninhabited. Right at the bottom of this rise, because, the countryside's moved. So at the bottom of this rise is this, flat area. So he said, "Well, this is great." And, we put up our tent. Now you can imagine what happened when the rains came that night.
Right.
We listening to music, it's freezing. There's rain. We get to the tent, which is, 10 or 15 feet from where we set it up as it's being washed, down. Further, along this area, and it's just sopping wet, and that wasn't fun.
No.
So we were just drenched. So I can't say it was one of the best concerts that I've gone to. We lasted, another day or so, listened to some music, and then we were just, covered with mud. If you saw the movie, of course, on that second day, Saturday, incredible storms, people sliding down mud trails and so on. We said, not for us.
Not for you.
So we walked, and there were still hundreds and hundreds of cars trying to get in. So we just kept walking down the road, and people asking how it was. And we told them how messy it was. And there was a VW bus. And we said, listen, it's going to take you another 3 hours to get there. And once you get there, the best is done. It's only mud. I'd turn back if I were you. And he says, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Hey, you got any room for us?
Yeah.
So we were able to go and hitch into the village in New York City. And then, you get on, I take the train, and I'm just, covered, with mud. And there are people with newspapers, looking at all of the pictures of the 500,000 people and kind of glancing my way. And I just sort of looked down. I needed a nap, most of the time. So it really wasn't quite good.
You didn't have as good a time as everyone, as the mythology would have us believe.
The mythology. Now, the other good news is my friend Mark, who did those things, he also, his parents' family owned this great steakhouse in New York. And he had a deal with the guy at the ticket office at Madison Square Garden. There'd always be VIP tickets. He would tell the guy, listen, anytime you and your wife want to come to the Old Homestead Steakhouse for dinner, be my guest. And by the way, if there are any VIP tickets left, you'll sell them to me for face value. And they made a deal. So I got to sit in the first row for 50, 60 Knick games during their championship years.
Oh, wow.
But better than that, first row to see the Rolling Stones in Madison Square Garden.
Well, there you go. That makes up for some of the mud, the cold, and the wet. All right. Well, that's a really good place for us to wrap it up. Thank you so much for being with us.
I got to end with one other thing.
Of course.
One of McConnell's jokes.
Yes.
Here's what McConnell would do when he'd be out there. This is going back to his presentations. And he's talking about his work in progress. And he would say, we wanted to see whether or not learning could be sexually transmitted. So we went out to Buckhorn Springs and we got these worms, these really big worms. We house them, they're mating like crazy. We take them and we start training them. They stop mating. We put them back in their houses. They mate like crazy again. Kind of makes you wonder about the value of an education.
And on that note.
And he delivered that with deadpan audacity.
All right. Thank you so much. So that's all for the 9th episode of the History of Psychology show. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to thank Larry Stern for having spent this time with us. And I'd like to invite you to make comments in the YouTube page. We always love to hear what you have to say about the show. And I'd like to remind you that there are show notes on the YouTube page, and they give a sort of minute-by-minute breakdown of the interview if there are parts that you'd like to hear again or parts that you'd like to show to your students. And I hope you'll come back in 2 weeks' time for our next episode of the History of Psychology show.